So this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be doing our second discussion from a couple of chapters from this book, The Hunger of Home, by Matthew Croasmun and Miroslav Volf, in which we're looking at kind of a theology of hospitality and theology of food. So in this chapter, or the couple of chapters we're going to look at this week, they make kind of an interesting argument. So they start by pointing out from Luke 4, this kind of one of the temptations that has to do with eating in bread. So they start out with, in Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, saying this, that Jesus returned from the Jordan Valley full of the Holy Spirit and was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. There he was tempted for 40 days by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and afterward Jesus was starving. The devil said to him, "Since you are God's son, command this stone to become a loaf of bread." But Jesus replied, "It is written, people won't live by bread alone." And so they continue to make this kind of interesting distinction where Jesus is both a kind of affirming hunger and the fact that we need to eat bread, but also recognizing that that isn't ours alone. They continue kind of making this argument by looking a next chapter when Jesus first begins calling his disciples, when he first starts interacting with who's going to become the disciple Peter in Luke chapter 5, which says, "When he finished speaking to the crowds, he said to Simon, 'Row out further into the deep water and drop your nets for a catch.' Simon replied, 'Master, we've worked hard all night and we've caught nothing, but because you say so, I'll drop the nets.' So they dropped the nets, and their catch was so huge that their nets were splitting. They signaled for their partners in the other boat to come and help them. They filled both boats so full that they were about to sink. When Simon Peter saw the catch, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, 'Leave me, Lord, for I'm a sinner.' Peter and those with him were overcome with amazement because of the number of fish that they had caught. James and John, Zebedee's sons, were Simon's partners, and they were amazed too. Jesus said to Simon, 'Don't be afraid. From now on, you will be fishing for people.' As soon as they brought the boats to the shore, they left everything and they followed Jesus." And so the argument they kind of make here is, that God is ultimately saying that he is the one who's going to provide, that life is much more than bread. And they make the argument that Peter here, just like we often do, right? He says, "Here, Master, we've worked hard all night and we've caught nothing." What is it that Peter is bringing to the table? It's often his hard work is how he will be provided for. We think that God must provide for us because we've been working hard. That's a very American way of handling things. We provide labor, therefore we should have enough to go through. And yet, like Peter, we often end up coming up empty. Our work is not enough to either sustain us or do the things that we think God is inviting to in the world. And so they kind of argue that this thrust in Peter's life where he starts out not having enough, becomes a disciple, and then through God's power ends up being able to provide and have enough, culminates in the feeding of the 5,000. And so this kind of sweep of Jesus saying that there's more to life than bread, and yet bread is important, to Peter kind of representing all of us saying, here's what I have to offer so I can make sure I have enough, to coming to the place where in God's power and strength, he is able to provide something he's not able to do on his own, and yet he's still distributing. He's part of it. He's part of the collaboration, right? So they kind of culminate these in this quote, in these ideas. So God's life-giving relation to us is not an add-on to a life already amply sustained from a plentiful food supply. Prone as we are to gloss relating to God as some sort of self-actualization, we can be tempted to think about relating to God as a nice-to-have after the basics of life are dealt with. We misunderstand human life if we reduce it to just bread. But we also misunderstand bread if we reduce it to just bread. A loaf of bread is the ordinary and most miraculous of things. Bread is an artifact of a particular creative potencies latent in the goodness of the interrelatedness of God's creation. It results from and sustains a set of relations between God, peoples, and the whole creation. All three are made at home with one another in bread that is not just bread. And so what I think they're trying to argue there is, again, God has provided grain and wheat, right? And yet people have turned this grain and wheat into a very particular bread, which would have been, barley bread back in the ancient world. But in other parts of the world, it's rice-based food, or it's maybe a flat bread, or maybe it's a rich, thick loaf of some kind. These are all different kinds of grains, potentialities, as they say it, that God has placed into it. And yet people, in their creativity, are providing for and sustaining one another, not just by their labor, but by how God has made things. God is providing, people are collaborating, and they see this kind of symbolically happening in Peter and the rest of the disciples, able to feed this great crowd of people with bread, which is including elements from both human and God, kind of creating things together, which is more. And so they kind of ask these questions of where we are seeing in the world. Where in our world do we recognize a preference for mere bread, for just getting by, for having enough, for sustenance being the most important thing? In what ways are we personally tempted to pursue mere bread? Our economic lives seem to be structured around what is systematically treated as mere work for mere bread. Can you think of ways to infuse your work with a sense of it being a gift and a collaboration with God in God's project? In what ways has God invited you to participate in Jesus' work of announcing the abundance of God's good gifts to the world? The other chapter in here starts from this section. One Sabbath, as Jesus was going through the wheat fields, his disciples were picking the heads of wheat, rubbing them in their hands and eating them. Some Pharisees said, "Why are you breaking the Sabbath law?" Jesus replied, "Haven't you read what David and his companions did when they were hungry? He broke the law by going into God's house and eating the bread of the presence, which only the priests can eat. He also gave some of the bread to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath.'" And their argument kind of in this chapter is that, Jesus could have argued the disciples are allowed to do this. They're practically homeless, right? They're itinerant preachers with Jesus being provided for by others. So under the law, they're allowed to do this thing. This is something that was in the Old Testament law. And yet the Pharisees are mad because they think everyone should be held not just to the bare minimum, the normal standards. They think everyone should be acting at a higher moral stance. They should be having the same stance of priests, in which they're meticulously guarding the Sabbath and guarding the way they dress and what they eat, etc. Because then we'll have God's favor, and then we can get what we want. So Jesus could have argued that way, but he instead makes the point from this kind of obscure case of when King David, on the run, does something kind of priestly, in which God provides for him for something that seems kind of outside the normal moral bounds from the land itself. And so they make the argument that as they are walking through the fields, that part of the Old Testament law in the section that Jesus could have quoted was the fact that the land is in fact God's. And so if God chooses to share from the wheat of the fields with the very least, that's his right to do so. But he also is pointing out a very specific thing about David. This is David, again, on the run before he's come into full power, before he's been fully enthroned. And this is hinting at, maybe in his mind, that he is in fact Messiah. He just doesn't look like Messiah because, like David at this point in his life, isn't fully enthroned. So building on that, those kind of two insights of this is God's land, and I don't look like Messiah because, like David, I haven't been enthroned yet. This is what they argue. Even now, Jesus is, as he taught us, anointed but not fully enthroned. The banquet to which we are invited beckons from the future of the advent of God. In the meantime, Jesus invites us to walk the fields in his presence and receive the goodness of God's gifts. He invites us to enter into his Jubilee work, liberating the land, driving out the illnesses, hunger, unjust structures, and evil powers that hold the land in captivity. He invites us to eat the fruit of the fields in ways which constitute homes at the sites of intimacy among God, people, and places. He invites us to hope for that day in which we may eat the banquet of the kingdom among fields, lakes, rivers, pastures, and seas, at home in having become the home of God. And so they're kind of just questions for living out this idea of jubilee, of restoration, of the king not yet enthroned. What might this look like? So what would Jesus' declaration of jubilee mean for your neighborhood or your city? And how are you being invited to participate in Jesus' mission of jubilee? And then they also point out Jesus honors hunger. How is Jesus inviting you to honor the hunger of those around you? Again, declaring the freedom and the wholeness and the jubilee of God. Not just in the future, not just when he's enthroned, but right now, in the fields, out in the places where, again, we collaborate with God, where we get to point to and talk about what God is up to in the world in this thing of Jubilee. So, yeah, dense amount of theological stuff I'm trying to condense down into a conversation, but I think there's some really important stuff in there about how God wants to interact with us, what God is actually up into the world, and what his simple things of being neighbors and eating with others has to do with kind of the grand story.